April 21st, 1934 was not just another day for cryptozoology. That day, all those who had ever claimed to believe that in the most remote places on the planet lived creatures that humans barely dared to dream of saw all their fantasies rewarded. Why? Simple. On that day, the London newspaper Daily Mail published an image showing something resembling a neck and a small head, sticking out of the water of Loch Ness in Scotland. The snapshot was as blurry as it was striking. That didn't seem to be the shape of anything other than the already legendary monster said to roam those latitudes. It was no small detail that the photo had been taken by a respectable surgeon who, as he would say, was enjoying the scenery when he noticed the enigmatic presence. By that afternoon, the image had traveled around the world and the subject had become an unexpected topic of discussion in the most unusual places. Suddenly, people who until then had been completely uninvolved with anything related to the search for strange creatures were left perplexed and astonished. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That wouldn't be the first time that supposed evidence of the monster made headlines in the press. The matter wouldn't end very well at all, and soon a web of deception as bizarre as the supposed beast would be uncovered. What are the oldest records we have of this creature? What explanations have the most skeptical people given over time? What missions and studies were carried out in those waters to try to uncover the truth? Did you know about something called the Loch Ness Phenomenon Investigation Bureau? What does the theory involving this creature say? With Aleister Crowley and interdimensional portals, to answer these and other questions, we're going to dive into the unusual story of the Loch Ness Monster. If you're interested in this story, we can do the story of the cousin, Nessie's distant cousin, which is Nahuelito, who lives in Lake Nahuel Huapi, here in Argentina. So if we have a lot of people asking for Nahuelito, we'll make a video about him. Comment the word monster down below, and if we see that you're interested, we'll make this second part. If not, we'll move on to something else. I also invite you, of course, to subscribe, leave a like, and leave suggestions for possible future videos. Let's get started. The first thing you need to know is that Loch Ness is located in the Highlands of Scotland. It has a surface area of 56 square kilometers and stretches for about 37 kilometers. Its great average depth makes it the largest container of fresh water in all the British Isles. All this means that for the area, the presence of Loch Ness is not only imposing, but vital. The first communities settled around it, and its waters have been, since time immemorial, the cradle of local folklore. In fact, Loch Ness is closely linked to the Kelpies, which are nothing more than aquatic mythological creatures with the ability to change shape. Their most conventional appearance is said to be that of horses or beautiful women. Under these disguises, these restless spirits would seduce men and then take them to their deep realms. It would be a one-way journey. That's why the Kelpies are respected and serve as a clear warning about the role of the forces of nature. As with many of these stories, it's likely that the figure of the Kelpies was used to try to keep children and the more reckless away from dangerous bodies of water. There are quite a few who believe that the oral tradition of the Kelpies may have been the origin of the first stories about a strange creature living in Loch Ness. Perhaps the stories of old changed over the decades, or maybe the suggestion, passed down from generation to generation, predisposed a series of witnesses. Witnesses who would later prove to be key in building one of the greatest cryptozoological beliefs. One way or another, it's clear that this lake has the seed of mystery in its very DNA, and for good reason. The mist and the vast natural space make that part of the map a land worthy of fairy tales or nightmares. It all depends on the lens through which we look. Because we don't just have to go back to the curious Kelpies if we want to understand Loch Ness's relationship with creatures that defy our logic. Let's get to know Saint Columba. This man was born on December 7th, 521, and today he is an Irish saint who is credited with having played a more than important role in the conversion of Scotland to Christianity in the 6th century. To fully grasp his importance, it's enough to know that he is one of the 3 patron saints of Ireland. In fact, it's not hard to find houses in Northern Ireland that are protected by his image. And every time a storm approaches, he is invoked to help prevent floods that could affect the infrastructure of the most vulnerable towns. Being a religious pioneer gave the biography of Saint Columba an aura where reality and fiction seemed to intertwine. According to ancient writings, the man had annihilated a wild humanoid that terrorized everyone. And how did he do it? Only with the power of his sickle. Feats of this kind abound in the books dedicated to him. The one we're interested in is said to have taken place in the year 565. It is believed that at that time Saint Columba faced a terrible creature that had emerged from Loch Ness. After placing a human decoy and summoning it, the future saint had cursed the creature, condemning it to years and years of exile. With this, he had freed the fishermen who were under its tyranny, earning part of the respect with which he would later be remembered. While for some these are typical exaggerations linked to this kind of character, others maintain that perhaps that anecdote is the oldest known reference to the monster, which years later would capture the attention of lovers of strange stories. Except for the Kelpies and the incident with Saint Columba, things around the lake remained calm. Of course, there was always someone pointing out a shadow in the mist, or rumors of some particular and deep roars. But none of that gained much relevance in the years that followed. It would not be until 1868 that the first report would appear, including the modern description of the monster we're interested in. It was a cold winter when a local newspaper, the Inverness Courier, dedicated a few lines to a story that had begun to spread among the townspeople. Apparently, a huge fish or some other creature had frightened some curious people who had approached the shores of the lake. Although most people preferred to make fun of the news during the day, by evening it was impossible not to remember the stories that grandmothers had woven into the land. Maybe they had caught a glimpse of a Kelpie. Had someone seen a being escaped from Celtic mythology? Maybe the beast cursed by Saint Columba. It had returned knowing that there was no one left with enough power to drive it away again, Lisa. And plainly, what was hiding in these icy waters? In 1880, a diver named Duncan MacDonald was assigned to explore a sunken ship at the western end of the lake. A few minutes after reaching the wreck, he frantically signaled to be brought back to the surface. Witnesses said the man came out of the water shaking and claimed he had seen a huge animal on a rock. His exact words were that it looked like a giant frog. The civilizations of progress led to roads being built around the vast lake sooner rather than later, and then the story of a possible monster only grew. When people started to travel closer and closer to the lake, it became clear that something used to distract them. Something big. Something very big, to be exact. And it would be from 1930 that the first wave of sightings would break out. First wave. A strange experience at Loch Ness. With that suggestive headline, the Scottish residents woke up, pen in hand. A journalist from the Northern Chronicle reproduced the testimony of two fishermen who claimed to have seen an animal whose size had caused a stir, a kind of whirlpool, near Torre Point. The repercussions were quite varied. Some seamen had a reputation for exaggeration, not to mention the fact that many had a history of alcoholism that stripped them of credibility. However, the most notable thing about that article in the Northern Chronicle was that it encouraged other fishermen to speak up. Although they didn't know it until then, many had had several similar experiences. Was it some kind of conspiracy among the fishermen to make fun of the rest of the population? What was going on? Stories about a monster started to become more and more common at an astonishing speed. In 1932, a man arrived at the local bars in a state of panic. He said that he had seen a creature similar to a crocodile, but of enormous size, running toward the lake. Less than a year later, more precisely on May 2nd, 1933. The aforementioned Inverness Courier caused a stir again when it decided to report what the manager of a local hotel, Aldi McKay, and her husband had described. According to the couple, they had seen a creature similar to a whale, having fun by spinning and diving, unashamed to do so in broad daylight. No need to wait another year this time. 3 months later, the same newspaper published a letter from a Londoner named George Spicer, who had experienced something unexpected. While traveling along the newly built road that ran along the north shore of the lake, the man was clear with his words, and I quote, "I saw the closest thing to a dragon or a prehistoric animal that I've ever seen in my life. It seemed to have a long neck that moved up and down as it walked." Sometime later, the story of a man who, while riding his motorcycle, had seen something similar would appear. Others talked about how the monster would come close to the shore to take away lambs and other animals. Panic was just around the corner, and Alex Campbell was directly responsible for much of what happened afterward. Campbell was a freelance correspondent who lived in a village on the shores of Loch Ness. When he realized how interested the newspapers and the public were in learning more and more about the monster, he specialized in the subject. He collected testimonies, interviewed hundreds of people, and was responsible for spreading the first theories about the possible origin of the animal. Some people didn't like Campbell and were sure that he made up everything he said. They even believed that it was his notes, in which he claimed that the monster would return, that made everyone confuse natural phenomena with other things. But there was also a part of the population that understood that what Campbell was doing not only entertained the curious, but also brought an increasingly noticeable number of tourists who came eager to learn more about that creature, which soon everyone would know by the friendly name Nessie. In that period, Campbell gained some significance to those who knew him. His fame grew even more when the British media realized there was a diamond in the rough there. Eager to join the monster craze, the newspaper The Scotsman sent journalist Philip Stocker to interview the ever-enthusiastic Campbell. What was surprising was that the man did not talk to the reporter about the stories he had collected. By that time, he was already declaring himself as one of the many witnesses of the creature. Without his hand trembling, Campbell told how he had been able to see Nessie on almost 20 occasions, some of them from very close up. It was because of this that Campbell would go down in history as the man who invented the monster. Or at least, that's what he was called by those who considered him a mere storyteller who was taking advantage of the situation to make some extra money. For his part, Stocker came to the following conclusion. In Loch Ness, there lived a great sea serpent that had come from the sea by swimming up the River Ness. The term sea serpent had been popular among sailors in the 18th century. Many of them claimed to have encountered these immense creatures, and the logs from those voyages provided chilling evidence about it. However, due to the lack of more convincing evidence, everything related to these beings had been forgotten. At least until Navy Commander Rupert Gould wrote a book arguing that these enormous reptiles had not only existed, but that they could be plesiosaurs, in other words, marine dinosaurs that supposedly went extinct in the Mesozoic era many millions of years ago. Gould himself would appear at Loch Ness in late 1933, and it was thanks to his work that Nessie ended up being given the form of a prehistoric creature. By autumn, the entire British press was after the Loch Ness mystery, and within a few weeks the story went international. With this, the demand for information grew, and people were no longer satisfied with just stories. The public, increasingly excited, began to ask for other kinds of evidence, and the evidence, of course, was not long in coming. Photo of Gray, November 12, 1933. It was Sunday, a sunny Sunday in Scotland. According to the people involved in this experience, Hugh Gray, an employee of Foyers Aluminium Works and a citizen highly respected by his colleagues and the community. He used to leave church and spend the rest of the morning walking along the shore of Loch Ness. This activity relaxed him and helped him prepare for the problems he would have to face when the work week began. He was lost in those thoughts when he saw something of considerable size emerging from the water. Without hesitation, in a second, the man parked the vehicle, took out his camera, and took a photograph that would soon go viral. Although that term didn't exist yet, that image, along with its story, would be part of the main body of the Scottish Daily Report. Gray's story was added to the growing number of reports about an unidentifiable creature in Loch Ness, but his photo marked a turning point. Many people believe that Gray's slide was the beginning of the modern era of Nessie hunting. Of course, the photo wasn't entirely clear, and, although it was never officially dismissed, several theories were developed about its authenticity. Some people see an animal surrounded by a splash of water in the image, while others believe it shows a Labrador swimming in the water. with a stick in its mouth or a swan diving. One way or another, it was clear that Nessie was not just a fad and that it was as relevant as ever. So the newspaper, the Daily Mail, decided to double down and made a risky move. In December 1933, they hired Marmaduke Weatherland with the purpose of tracking the beast everyone was talking about. Marmaduke had a strange background. Born in 1883, the man was an actor, screenwriter, producer, and film director. By 1916, he had acted in silent films both in the United Kingdom and in South Africa. He then produced, directed, and starred in Livingston and Robinson Crusoe from 1925 and 1927 respectively. He was considered a talented person with his own vision, ambition, and above all, perseverance. That's why the Daily Mail saw him as the ideal person for the job. A job that meant facing ridicule, but also spending hours and hours without achieving anything. He was ready to innovate. His bosses gave him a large sum and hoped for the best. The results of that didn't take long to appear. It wasn't long before Marmaduke contacted the newspaper's headquarters to deliver an extraordinary piece of news. He had found some unusual tracks near the lake, tracks that didn't match any animal in the area. Photos were taken of them, molds were made, and soon the Daily Mail was envied by all its competitors. The issues in which they covered the journey of their star explorer became record sales. The world now not only had a blurry photo, but also a possible footprint of the animal. Or so it was believed for weeks. Everything fell apart when the laboratory results were made public. Those tracks were not from a dinosaur or an unknown specimen, they were footprints of a rhinoceros. But how did they get there? The mystery came to an end when someone discovered that in one of the movies he had directed, Marmaduke had used an ashtray as a prop that was, in fact, mounted on a replica of a rhinoceros foot. The deception became obvious, and overnight the British newspaper became the laughingstock of journalists who devoted lengthy paragraphs to mocking their gullibility. The Daily Mail, for its part, published a statement against Marmaduke, accusing him of being a fraud. Not only was he fired, but it's believed that because of that editorial, he was left with no chance to rebuild his career. Had all of this already gone too far? No, the truth is that the mythology of Nessie was just taking its first steps. In 1934, Gray's photo was overshadowed in the public's mind by what became known as the surgeon's photograph, attributed to a London doctor. The photo would become an emblem, although few know its terrible background. And that's how our story returns to the beginning. More and more photographs. The photo that came to light on April 21st, 1934 left no room for doubt. It wasn't blurry and it didn't show a distorted back. In this photo, the shape is recognizable and it's probably one of the most iconic images of Nessie. Thanks to this photo, the idea that Loch Ness hid a plesiosaur in its waters became firmly established in popular culture. After all, it did have a long neck. The photo was published by the aforementioned Daily Mail, which showed great boldness by returning to a topic that months earlier had earned it the disdain of other media outlets. This time they claimed to have checked the photo and its source. It didn't seem to be a fake, and the person who had sent it was a healthcare professional with a spotless record. Why would someone like that risk their career for a simple joke? From then on, every book that talked about the creature started to include that postcard, which meant a lot of money for everyone who shared the rights to it. With this, the Daily regained the trust of its readers, and Nessie went from being a celebrity to a living legend. For more than 60 years, this image was analyzed, studied, exhibited, and replicated. At cryptozoology conferences, it was spoken of in a solemn way as solid and valuable evidence. And if today it is still an image that appears on t-shirts and souvenirs, it's partly because there was always an effort to make sure that what happened to it in the 1990s didn't come to light with the proper impact. And it's because around that time, the fraud came to light and was told firsthand by one of the perpetrators. It was surprising when a man said in front of the cameras that he and his stepfather had faked the image using a toy submarine, to which they had added a neck made of putty and cardboard. But even more surprising was when he confessed who his stepfather was. Have you guessed who it was yet? A person we've already discussed. Yes, exactly, it was Marmaduke. The guy had been resentful toward the newspaper, and his revenge for being called a scammer was to show them how, in fact, he could scam them even more than they thought. Apparently, and according to the perpetrator who confessed, Marmaduke had planned to inform the newspaper that they had paid him a small fortune for a fake photo of the monster. After a few months, though, everything had escalated so much and so quickly that he preferred to remain silent. At least until 1939, when he died. This evidence-backed revelation turned everything upside down, proving the subject was truthful. And we'll see what would happen next. In the meantime, let's go back to those years when the fraud had not yet been discovered. Monster hunters, bounty hunters, and simple enthusiasts began to see Loch Ness as the mecca of their journeys. There, one could come across a unique animal and the possibility of a hefty check. Particularly famous in the 1950s was the photo by Peter McNab. It was published by the Weekly Scotsman and is still widely regarded by fans of this story today. By the 1960s, Nessie was still loved as a local monster, but for the rest of the world, its image began to fade. The lack of new reports made many believe that its decline had finally come. No one could have foreseen the imminent arrival of the first video of the beast, and on a primetime news broadcast. Born in 1924, Tim Dinsdale had a life full of adventures since he was a child. Due to his father's job, he traveled frequently. At age 10, pirates captured the ship he was aboard. Did he escape unscathed? After that, he craved more adrenaline-fueled experiences. His life took an unexpected turn when he learned about Nessie's story. From then on, Tim was convinced that he had come into this world to prove that the mentioned creature was real. And how would he do it? With the evidence that, without even trying, had fallen into his hands. 6 days of observation around Loch Ness had rewarded him with a unique event. Dinsdale had been able to see the monster, and not only that, but he had also filmed it. His tape still generates debates today and was the cornerstone for the reinvention of Nessie's story in the 1960s. This time, it was transformed into the Holy Grail for a group of people who had a single purpose: to capture it with their cameras. Tim's tape was shown on the British Broadcasting Corporation's Panorama program. The man would say that his wish had been for the Queen of England to be the first to see the footage. By that time, it was known that part of the royal family was interested in the possible presence of a living creature in those bodies of water. In fact, it is believed that it was thanks to the royal family that in 1962 the Loch Ness Phenomenon Investigation Bureau was established. This bureau, made up of adventurers, television producers, politicians, and conservationists, was responsible for organizing groups of volunteers to visually sweep the lake. At that time, the peculiar bureau also joined forces with another group, the Academy of Applied Sciences, based in the United States, led by the inventor and lawyer Robert Reines. And we want to focus on him. It turns out that in 1972, a group led by this man obtained some underwater photographs after using sonar and cutting-edge technology for that time. The idea was that some cameras placed under the boats would be activated when the presence of something large enough was detected. The matter involved a huge investment, which was soon justified. After the radar went crazy showing the presence of something huge, the cameras were triggered. To find out what had been recorded on the reels, the raw footage had to be sent to special laboratories. Then, a press conference was held to show the results. And what happened then? The world let out a long exclamation. Rhymes and Sir Peter Scott, one of Britain's most well-known naturalists, unveiled the semi-blurry image of something they claimed was a rhomboid fin. They confidently presented this as undeniable evidence. And Scott was quick to point out that the scientific name of the monster would henceforth be Nesisterus rhombopteryx, which comes from Greek and means nest monster with diamond-shaped fin. With its naming, Nessie would be allowed to be added to a British register of officially protected wildlife. But once again, the excitement didn't last among the monster's fans. And that's because sometime later, it was discovered that the images Rhymes and Scott had shown were digitally altered. According to them, they had done it to clean up the photos from irregularities. However, something was more than clear. Without the aforementioned digitization, the original photos only showed blotches and the possible sediment at the bottom of the lake. Nothing, not even remotely similar to a fin. Why had that evidence been manipulated? Was it another attempt to keep making money thanks to the possible presence of a monster? The fact that the men involved had direct contacts with the exclusive laboratories that had refined the image only served to muddy the situation. As if that weren't enough, Rhymes generated more controversy later on, when some researchers looked into his background and discovered that he didn't have the track record or scientific credentials he claimed or implied. And this was just the tip of the iceberg, because on the other side of the lake, a hunter was starting to make a name for himself, of being the person who had the most evidence about Nessie. According to the records, Frank Searle appeared at Loch Ness on June 16, 1969. The nearly 50-year-old man had a confident demeanor and a hostile attitude. His past was largely unknown. As a young boy, he was in the army, and it is believed that after suffering a serious accident, he spent part of his adulthood living a simple life, until, inspired by adventure books, he went to live on the shore of Loch Ness. There, he set up a tent and managed a self-sufficient life in the wild, taking photos and contemplating nature. This practice, combined with his military training, had prepared him, according to him, to be extremely quiet and a very good observer. Gradually, he grew obsessed with Nessie. After people mocked his testimonies, he started revealing his photographs. Photographs that would soon become the center of attention for many of those who came to the area. Frank had so much to show that he soon set up an improvised museum and began selling pamphlets telling his experiences. This brought him moderate popularity and allowed him to swap his tent for a better equipped trailer. Frank was somewhat eccentric. He tended to exaggerate a lot in his stories. He had clear intentions of seducing the girls who came to him. And did he take every opportunity he had to say that people like Tim Reens or Scott were his enemies? According to him, those people only wanted to use the monster to get rich. He, however, considered himself worthy of being able to exploit the creature. After all, they shared a habitat. Anyway, Searle published his first photo on June 27, 1972. From then on, he didn't stop. How could it be that the investigation office couldn't get a single piece of evidence, and he kept taking more and more amazing photos? Frank laughed at the question as if the answer were obvious. He knew what he was doing, unlike the others. Although it's true that thanks to Frank's constant complaints, it was proven that the investigation office regularly requested huge funds from various entities, both private and public. Frank also failed to uphold the ethical standards he claimed to have. At a certain point, the way he made photo montages came to light and his credibility took a hit. By then, he was a colorful character, and many of those who visited the lake for the monster made it a point to stop by his museum. But the public's affection wasn't enough, and once he was exposed for his fakes, the man was no longer asked to give interviews. The media stopped paying him for his originals, and little by little, he saw his modest empire fall. One day, just as he had appeared, he disappeared. Today, serious researchers don't give any credence to any of his stories. Although many point out that the man ended up being important for the preservation of monsters in the collective imagination. Meanwhile, for some, his work only discredited those who were looking for real evidence. For others, he was just a harmless trickster who had become part of the scenery, entertaining tourists. Other now canonical photos, like Peter O'Connor's, emerged during that period. In fact, photos that are occasionally dusted off and bring up old questions. In 1987, in view of a society with more and better resources, the vigils were abandoned and Operation Deep Scan was carried out, deploying sonar throughout the lake. Although its organizers claimed they found an unidentified object of unusual size and strength in the deepest part of the lake, there was no conclusive evidence. In the years that followed, there were more expeditions, other videos. New people entered the scene, and major media outlets produced extensive documentaries. The conclusion was always the same. Did the Loch Ness monster really exist, or was it all a misunderstanding that had escalated to unimaginable levels? It wasn't until April 2016 that a Norwegian company proposed using an underwater drone equipped with sonar to map the bottom of the lake. And although many seemed skeptical, the monster appeared. The name of the company was Kongsmer Maritime, and they were determined to put an end to the mystery. With their advanced technology, they set out to investigate the more than 226 meters of depth of the lake. The mission went smoothly until, at a certain moment, they came across a shape that matched the description that has been given to the Loch Ness monster for many years. At last, the creature had been found resting peacefully. After the initial excitement and spending thousands of dollars, the company eventually realized that they hadn't actually found Nessie, but rather a replica of it. Yes, you heard that right. It turns out that at the end of the 1960s, a movie titled The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes was filmed, in which the famous detective had an encounter with the enigmatic creature of the lake. For this, they had built a 9-meter model of the monster, which included a neck and 2 humps. It had been taken to a dock to film parts of the movie. However, the director was not pleased with the final product and asked for some parts to be removed from the huge structure. Although he was warned that this could cause the model to sink, he insisted on his demand. And the Nessie double lost buoyancy and ended up buried, where it would remain alone for almost 50 years until the Norwegian company found it. 2 years later, in 2018, a group of researchers conducted a DNA study in Loch Ness to determine what organisms live in its waters. This study revealed that there were really large eels in those latitudes. Could this be the explanation for everything? Those who don't believe in the monster point out that many sightings can be easily debunked. What looks like a creature similar to Nessie could actually be a boat's wake, a log, other floating debris, or bubbles bursting on the surface. That, among many other things. Some historians highlight the fact that sightings became more frequent, as we mentioned, with the construction of the road near the lake. It's important to keep in mind that when that road was built, a lot of trees were cut down and many species were driven out of their natural habitat. Could it be that the first encounters with the alleged Nessie were nothing more than frightened animals that had lost their home? Does that explain why at one time Nessie was seen wandering along the shore, something that didn't happen later on? It is also believed that the different interpretations of the monster's photographs could be attributed to pareidolia, the human tendency to give an ambiguous image a shape, a pattern, or a meaning, where there aren't any. It's clear that there are plenty of theories, both for the believers and for those who remain skeptical. Let's dive into that. Dinosaur, elephant, or shark? One prevalent idea is that Nessie is a dinosaur. Let's explore why this is a common belief. For many, this idea is not only unlikely, but impossible. Among the reasons for dismissing the idea of a plesiosaur in Loch Ness as implausible, experts point out that there would need to be a breeding colony of such creatures in order for them to survive in the long term. Many biologists also point out that Loch Ness is not large or productive enough to support a sustainable biomass, not even a small family of these creatures. On the other hand, it is known today that because of the shape of its neck, plesiosaurs would not be able to stick their heads out the way Nessie is supposed to. Not to mention that due to their own anatomy, one of these animals would have to come up to breathe much more frequently, causing many more sightings than there actually are. Many cryptozoologists ask that we not lose sight of the fact that Loch Ness is a lake with an outlet to the sea during certain times of the year, which would give us the possibility that perhaps the monster is not native to the lake itself, but rather a frequent visitor. This would also explain its appearance for short periods of time. While the plesiosaur concept still resonates strongly, other ideas also gained popularity. For a while, the explanation that said the Loch Ness monster was nothing more than an elephant became popular. Let me explain. When an elephant swims, it sticks its trunk out to breathe. If we add that part of its head is exposed, we get the typical picture of Nessie, with part of its neck and hump sticking out. According to some, there are records that a traveling circus with elephants passed by the lake in the 1930s. This coincided with the rise in monster sightings. It is believed that this circus later stopped in nearby towns, but always repeated the routine of taking its elephants to bathe in the lake. This would explain the strange sightings that occurred between the 1930s and 1940s approximately. However, this theory leaves several loose ends. No one realized that they were elephants all this time. Did the media hide the circus story to maintain the lie? Did this make sense? And how do you explain the sightings that happened afterward? Later on, the idea of the pachyderm lost momentum, and the role of the animal to explain the monster was taken over by another sea creature. More precisely, a shark, but not just any shark, rather the terrifying Greenland shark. The Greenland shark is a species that lives in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, including the coast of Scotland. They can reach lengths of up to 7 meters and have a shape that could be mistaken for that of a sea monster, especially when they partially emerge from the water. Those who support this theory point to another important fact. The Greenland shark is known for being one of the longest living vertebrates on the planet, with an estimated lifespan of between 250 and 500 years. This could unify the sightings of Nessie over the decades and would explain why the creature doesn't need to reproduce to play a prominent role in different eras. Was it always just one of these solitary animals lost in the huge lake? Those who believe this add that it's likely that this shark has now died, given the few reports of the monster in recent years. This is what those who choose to discredit the idea of Nessie as a little-known animal believe. Now let's learn about the strangest theories. Are you ready? This could totally change the perspective you have about Nessie. In recent years, a British geneticist proposed explaining Nessie by talking about another aquatic creature, one just as enigmatic, but much less known. We're talking about the famous beast of Stronsay. On September 25, 1808, the corpse of an unidentified organism washed up on the coast of Stronsay Island in Scotland. Witnesses reported the corpse was 16.8 meters long, excluding the tail. The Edinburgh Natural History Society was unable to identify the body and decided that it was a new species, probably a sea serpent. According to descriptions of the animal, it had 3 pairs of appendages described as legs or wings. Its skin was smooth when stroked from head to tail and rough when stroked from tail to head. Its fins were edged with something resembling hair, and it had a row of bristles along its back that glowed in the dark when they were wet. The contents of its stomach were red. The Scottish naturalist Patrick Neal even gave the monster a scientific name. But shortly after, a London anatomist asked to dismiss this, claiming that the measurements were exaggerated. The man explained that, without a doubt, they were looking at the body of a decomposing basking shark. From that moment on, opinions were divided, and the mystery remains. Today, Simpson, a scientist specialized in evolutionary genetics, believes that perhaps the Stronsay beast is the corpse of a creature like Nessie, which would mean that the creature in the lake would not be alone, and that there was more evidence of its existence than we ever imagined. The professional's words were, and I quote, as she handed me the analysis of the bones and the sightings. Nessie and the beast of Stronsay share many similarities, which is quite interesting. So, it's likely that before it was called Nessie, that animal everyone is looking for was named the beast of Stronsay. Are we dealing with the same species of animal that ended up starting in 2 different legends? And that's not the most surprising part. There's another group of followers of the Loch Ness story who believe that Nessie isn't exactly a flesh and blood creature, but rather a kind of entity. Do you remember Tim Dinsdale, the first one to record it? Well, he was one of those who sympathized with the argument that Nessie's origin wasn't necessarily linked to zoology. Is Nessie a supernatural creature? One of the theories claims that yes, and it's even likely that we know who was responsible for its existence. We're talking about none other than the dark Aleister Crowley, who was once labeled as the most evil man on Earth. Nessie, a product of sex magic? This video won't explore the dizzying life of Aleister Crowley. If interested, request a video about him in the comments. We'll just mention that he was an influential occultist, mystic, alchemist, writer, poet, painter, and British ceremonial magician who founded the religious philosophy of Thelema. Crowley spoke of will as the only law that every human being should follow. His individualistic and provocative discourse, along with his constant defense of the right to pleasure, made him for many a despicable and censurable person. Throughout his life, the man boasted of having contact with entities from the beyond. For some, he became a spiritual leader of sorts, willing to take his group to a new level of experiences. And knowing that there were many eyes on him, Crowley began at a certain point to look for a remote place to stay. He needed privacy to continue with his rituals, and that's why he was fascinated when, in 1899, he found out Boleskine House. Boleskine House is a property located on the southern shore of Loch Ness, in Scotland, that covers 14 hectares. Today, the mansion is considered haunted and cursed, largely due to Crowley's supposed influence. Once he had control of that land, the man set the second part of his plan in motion. He organized orgies and invocation ceremonies with a great amount of energy. Rumor has it that several of those who stayed for a while in Boleskine or who participated in Crowley's rituals experienced strange episodes or unexpected breakdowns. There are plenty of stories about participants who, at a certain moment, went insane and ran out of the house naked. They would run to their cars and never look back. What was happening within those walls? Well, that's not clear. There's only one conclusion that everyone comes to, whatever it was. Crowley had lost control of the situation. There were violent episodes, attempted murders, people who took their own lives. With excessive pride, Crowley would boast that he had summoned around 115 spirits during the years he lived there. Some of the followers even claimed that Lucifer himself had been among the entities that had manifested. A considerable number of accounts claim that by 1913 the forces within Boleskine were unleashed. Crowley had opened more portals than he could close, and soon his life was in danger. Is that supposed to be why he ended up selling the property? Afterwards, the house had several owners, and the strange stories, as well as the tragedies, didn't stop. Kenneth Unger, an experimental filmmaker and author of 2 books about Hollywood secrets, lived there for a while. He was the second guest of honor at Boleskine until 1970. The property was acquired by Jimmy Page, guitarist of Led Zeppelin and an occult enthusiast. Even though Page ended up using the house much less than he expected, there were still those who blamed it for the bad streak that would later plague Zeppelin. With the death of their drummer, John Bonham, and Carrick, Robert Plant's young son. Later on, the house would have fires and everything around it would remain covered in a dense mist. What matters to us at this point is a crazy theory, increasingly supported by more internet users. One that says that maybe Nessie isn't a conventional animal, but rather a kind of monster from the underworld. That it would have escaped from one of the portals created by Crowley during those years when he focused all his potential on the area. Could Nessie be an interdimensional beast or a deity from another world trapped in this one, because of the whims of a man who didn't know how to put a limit on his fantasies? It's clear that Nessie is much more than just a famous cryptid. It's a living story that has been unfolding for decades. It's a tourist attraction, a business, and living proof of how much we like to believe in monsters. Nessie is also a certainty. We can never know the truth behind some questions for a simple reason. It can be hard to distinguish truth from lies. Sometimes only uncertainty survives, along with the eternal promise that we could be the next witnesses. Finally, Nessie is a reminder of how unexplored certain aspects of nature are. Thanks to the interest this creature sparked, important explorations were carried out that have helped and continue to help us better understand the majestic lake that is believed to shelter it. Nessie sometimes appears to be captive to human ambition. His image was exploited to exhaustion, and his myth seduced and continues to seduce unscrupulous people who only want to see how they can keep squeezing it. Conversely, the monster is synonymous with adventure and freedom. The possibility of its existence encouraged many to dare to live unique experiences of their kind, always driven by the desire to see it in all its magnificence. The model used for the movie The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes is still sunk in the lake. Do you know that taking it out could threaten its preservation? It's also known that the toy submarine Marmaduke used to take his iconic photo was also forgotten on the muddy shores. We can say, without fear of being wrong, that Loch Ness contains many lake monsters within it. More precisely, all the ones humanity dared to dream of. All of them, in their own way, roam those waters like ghosts and symbols, as a connection to our most primitive fascination, prehistory embodied. Deception perpetrated in the demon time. One way or another, Nessie managed to transcend each and every one of its versions to become something much greater. Will we see it again soon? Will it captivate the public again eventually? All we can do is keep our eyes fixed on the horizon and stay alert. You never know when the ultimate proof might emerge from the depths.